So, what is empathy and how can we show it to others? Find out on this episode of IncreMental Health Tips. Welcome to IncreMental Health Tips. My name is Jared, and as always, I'm joined by my co host Liz. Today, we're going to be talking about empathy and how we can show empathy to others perhaps more effectively than we currently do. So, to begin, whenever empathy is mentioned, there can be a lot of confusion around it, just because concepts like empathy, compassion, sympathy can oftentimes be used interchangeably and while being entirely different. So just to give us a starting point of reference, Liz, how would we differentiate between empathy, compassion, and sympathy, which are commonly confused with one another and used interchangeably?
That's a great point. So with sympathy, very often that's the one that has to do with sharing the feelings of another person. So if you know someone who's recently lost someone, you'll say you have my sympathy. And you're sharing in that loss with them, but at the same time recognizing that that loss is so much greater for the person who's closer to the loss. Compassion has to do with a feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for a person who's facing a misfortune, but it's also accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate that suffering. So that's like when someone will bring some chicken noodle soup to someone who's sick in order to show them some compassion that they recognize they're going through a hard time. And with empathy, very often what people think of with empathy is that strong emotional vicarious feeling that you have this emotional reaction to someone who's going through a hard time. But that's not the only aspect of empathy. There's also the verbal aspect of empathy that has to do with how we express empathy to another person.
Well, I do think that that's where a lot of our listeners, perhaps in their own relationships, might experience some difficulty, because I personally, I'll put myself out there, have been accused of not showing empathy over a situation that I actually did feel very bad about. But then again, I do think that there's this tendency for us all to second guess how we're feeling and wonder, okay, well, did I feel enough empathy for it? So first, just as a place to begin, how do we know we are experiencing empathy? Like, how is that something we can identify within our own emotions and response?
So when you have that emotional reaction, so you can think of in a stronger version, maybe this is the person who cries at movies. They've got that strong emotional connection to what's going on. And I mean, this can also happen if you know someone who's going through a stressful time. You may start to feel stressed, even though it's their stress that you're feeling instead of, being stressed about your own circumstances.
So it's like you tensing up if you're watching a movie where a character is like maybe checking a house for bad guys or whatever. You might actually feel your own muscles tense up because this character is in a tense, sort of suspenseful moment. That would be a feeling of empathy.
Yeah, so that's the emotional part of empathy, that you're feeling what the other person is feeling. So the verbal part of empathy is a bit different, though, because you can say, I feel that, I understand what you're going through. I get the sense of it, but that's not actually expressing empathy to the other person. What people really usually want to hear is that you acknowledge how hard it is for them. So it's not about, oh, you feel bad for me. They want to know that you acknowledge this is hard for them.
Or how they feel, because there are some situations where if somebody's going through a difficult time or a loss, they may not want to be engaged on it. And so showing empathy in that case would be to not tell them you know how they feel, but rather know how they feel and respect, well, and show them that you respect their desires. Although with that, there's some caveats to that, because that's a bit of a cop-out just to just to ignore people or be uncaring. So I think that there's a balance there.
Yeah, I went into counseling because I thought, oh, I'm a really empathetic person. I feel an emotional reaction when I hear someone's going through something, so I want to be able to help them. I have that compassionate side. But then I actually took my skills lab training and, was learning all these counseling skills, and we covered empathy. And I realized, oh no, I'm not empathetic. I don't have an idea what empathy is when we're speaking about verbal empathy, because empathy really conveys that sucks. That must be hard. And, or it could be saying, that sounds really frustrating, or you sound really frustrated. So it's an acknowledgement of what the other person is going through in a way that they hear that you're acknowledging what they're going through.
Whereas what you were believing was you being a really empathetic person was actually perhaps you feeling the pain of others.
Yeah, and I do think it is important to have that emotional side too. There are some people who struggle to connect with that emotional side of feeling what someone else is going through. But people, they really want to hear that you understand what they are going through. So if you know someone who's going through a hard time and you're trying, maybe your spouse is saying, oh, you're not empathetic, you don't understand. Maybe they just want you to say, that sucks. That must be hard. Sorry you had a bad day. Sorry this is so hard for you. Sorry your boss is so difficult. Just acknowledging that it's hard. People don't always want things fixed. Sometimes they just really want to hear that you acknowledge that they're going through a hard time.
Well, and that's an important distinction too, because empathy can be showed also through action. The should I fix this? But an important distinction, trying to fix something when somebody doesn't want you to fix it can actually create more problems than than it actually solves. So that could even be a question. So also in how you articulate empathy is important, because if you your spouse or partner had a really rough day at work, and also were going to be preparing dinner when you get home, and they express how hard of a day they had at work or whatever their situation is, and then you empathize with them. Oh, that must have been really hard, but how's dinner coming? That's going to come off as very uncaring. And so being cognizant of some of these dynamics is also important. I mean, that's an exaggerated example, but this can happen in more subtle ways too.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you think of a couple that has young children, one says, I'm tired, the other one's likely to say, I'm tired too, and think that they're being empathetic, when really, they're saying, yeah, I understand the feeling, but they're not really actually acknowledging their partner's difficulty in that moment. They're matching that this is hard for me too, instead of just saying, yes, I know it's hard for you.
Well, I think it comes down to the fact that so much of communication is not verbal. And so there's everything from your tone, your body language, there's a lot to this. And so if you really are in a state where you understand how someone feels, being able to respond to it appropriately is a skill. It's something that each and every one of us can develop and work on. So is there any practical suggestions that you have, Liz, for how our listeners can work on developing their empathy and how they express empathy?
So, if you're struggling with the emotional part of empathy, I think trying to think through how you might feel in that situation and just trying to get an understanding for, maybe if you wouldn't have the same emotional reaction, just understanding why that person is having that emotional reaction and getting a better sense of just emotions in general. So, some people, they do have a hard time with experiencing emotions, so they might need to learn about emotions from other people.
Well, and also knowing that people experience emotions differently. Just if somebody's having a really hard time with something you might think isn't a big deal, there's a bit of also understanding that, well, not everybody feels the same way I do about things.
Yeah, and as well, sometimes someone is struggling with something that seems smaller because they actually just don't want to discuss the thing that's the main part of their stress. So very often I'm the one who's going to hear the whole story, whereas, if someone's talking to a friend or a coworker, they might only share a small piece of what's stressing them out. So they might seem like they're having this huge reaction to this small thing, but really they're stressed about something totally different, and that stress is just bleeding into every part of their life. So, trying to acknowledge, hey, I see you're stressed. I see you're having a hard day today. Just having those acknowledgments that you can say to someone that focuses on their experience in that moment, it really does help them to feel like someone gets it.
Well, and obviously at IncreMental Health Tips, we of course would let you know that even little adjustments, just bit by bit, is how you develop and how you improve. And so it's important to keep that in mind. But I think that's where we're going to stop for today. But if you are enjoying our content, please like, share, and comment. We would love to hear your thoughts, and we appreciate all the support that we've been receiving. It's really been it's really been encouraging to us, as these are really difficult times for a lot of people, and we really think that mental health awareness really needs to spread. So we appreciate each and every one of you, and until next time, remember that small steps can lead to big changes, and we'll see you next time.